crime involves issues of life and death, of things that are, of security and of being able to live safe and secure in our communities and raise our families. And I happen to, for example, live in a relatively low crime city in Guelph and live in a very, very low crime neighborhood in the suburbs towards the outskirts of Guelph. And I'm very lucky and privileged to be able to do that. But I know that the sort of difference that is between when I lived even in downtown Guelph or downtown Calgary in the past, downtown Halifax, of just being, surrounded by more criminal activity going on in one's quality of life. And to the extent that we can improve that, I think that's extremely important.
Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, back with another edition of Inside Policy, MLI's podcast on all things domestic policy. It's my great pleasure to be joined by Dave Snow, Professor of Political Science at the University of Guelph and MLI Senior Fellow. Dave has written many things for MLI, including the most recent edition of our Justice Report Card, Studies on the Prevalence and Effects of DEI Research in Universities, and much more. Today, Dave is here with me to discuss a recent report he co-authored with statistician and senior fellow Rick Audas on violent urban crime rates in major Canadian cities. Dave, thanks so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Peter. It's a great pleasure.
Let's dive right in, Dave. So for starters, could you describe the scope of this report, what it covers, and the sources of the data?
Sure. So basically, this covers a 10-year period of police-reported data on 4 violent crimes that 9 major cities in Canada contribute to this international organization composed of American and Canadian cities called the Major Cities Chiefs Association, or MCCA. So every quarter, these 9 cities, which depending on how you count it, are either the 9 biggest cities in Canada or 9 of the 10. If you use the American definition, Durham would be in the top 9, and they're not in there. But basically, they're the what you would think is the 9 major cities. So we've got Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, York Region, and Peel Region, and then Montreal, Ottawa, and Winnipeg. I missed Winnipeg on my west to east there. And so they contribute their quarterly data on criminal incidents. We use the word crime sort of as shorthand, but these are police-reported criminal incidents. So this is not, and it's the same thing Statistics Canada does. It's not something that's been through the courts and someone's been criminally convicted. But criminal incidents on aggravated assault, sexual assault, that's levels 1, 2, and 3 in the criminal code, all sexual assaults, robbery, and homicide. And so they've been doing this, some of them for more than 10 years on the MCCA website. They have the raw data available, just numbers per municipality. And for sort of reasons of some PDFs being available, others not, the quarterly data go back 5 years, but the annual data go back 10 years. And so what Rick and I did is we plugged these 10 years of annual data into spreadsheets, combined them with Statistics Canada population estimates, and determined rates of these crimes for all 9 cities over 10 years. And we looked at things including 3 years rolling averages and individual years. We used the rolling averages to get out fluctuations in the data. And all of that is to say that we've just got a good sense of what's been happening with respect to these 4 violent crimes in these 9 cities over the last 10 years.
Great. And just building up on that, then, what are the trends that you've discovered for these 4 crimes, according to the report?
So in particular, I'd say there's 4 things that I point out that really stick out to me. And the first is with respect to sexual assault. What we did for all 9 cities and all 4 of these crimes is we measured the averages, the 3 rolling averages, over what we call long-term, medium-term, and short-term. So we're looking at the most recent year is 2023, and that's really an average of 21, 2, and 3. And so Long-term compares that to 2014 to 2016. Medium-term compares that to 2017 to 2019. And then short-term is just the year-over-year change. And basically, you've got sort of 27 different data points there. And for sexual assault, it's up across like 25 or 26. And so short-term, long-term, medium-term, all 9 cities, I think Ottawa is the one outlier for certain terms. Sexual assault is up. Yeah, I've got here Ottawa is short-term only, Calgary not medium-term. Everywhere else, the rates are up, and you see the chart sort of in the clearest direction. So that's our first, really interesting and sort of consistent finding. The second is that we see some cities with just much higher crime rates, violent crime rates. For anyone who follows this stuff closely, it won't be that surprising, but especially Winnipeg and Edmonton, and of those two, especially Winnipeg, its rates are just, some of our charts, it's difficult to tell what's going on in the other cities because Winnipeg is so much higher. We almost sort of need a different chart for Winnipeg. And so in terms of places where violent crime is high, we see a bit of an east-west tilt, which is consistent with what we found in our Justice Report Card, where Peel, York, and Ottawa, and I should say to our non-Toronto area listeners or non-Ontario listeners, Peel is sort of the region that includes Mississauga and Brampton primarily. York is the region immediately north of Toronto, so includes things like Markham and that area. So Peel, York, and Ottawa, generally lower rates of crime, to a lesser extent Montreal too. Winnipeg and Edmonton, especially in the West, higher rates of violent crime. Vancouver and Calgary tend to be in the higher range. Toronto is the one outlier that it's more often sort of the 6th or 7th highest of these 9. So lots of variation in terms of rates with Winnipeg and Edmonton. The two other things that I'd highlight are first that there's not necessarily correlation between trend lines and low crime rates. So Winnipeg is the exception to that rule. Winnipeg has high crime and increasing crime. Winnipeg, this is not a good news story for Winnipeg. But the other two places that have worrying increases in violent crime rates across basically all four crimes here are York and Montreal. And York is comparatively low levels of crime, but in some areas it's basically doubled over the last 10 years in terms of rates. We're not even talking absolute numbers. Montreal's in the middle. Montreal's numbers also increasing, kind of alarmingly. And on the other side, Edmonton is very high and Calgary is quite high, but those cities have, some crimes that are going down, some that are going up. Calgary's homicide rate in particular has seen some really big drops. And finally, the fourth thing I'd say, I know I've gone on a bit here, Peter, in the summary points, is that because we're in an era where the last 5 years of data at Statistics Canada level, at this level, undoubtedly show a general and quite consistent increase in violent crime and violent crime severity across the country and across most provinces. And 2023 actually was a smaller increase, but nevertheless still an increase. Given that we see nuance in these major cities, which I should say make up 1/3 of the Canadian population almost exactly, that's more evidence, and there is more detailed evidence on this in Statistics Canada, that actually the rates of increase of violent crime are worse in our rural and smaller areas, right? Because if we've got high levels of violent crime in general and sort of moderate increase in these 9 largest cities, worse in some, better in others, then just by implication, it means that it's the smaller areas, and there are data to back that up, where the rates of violent crime are actually increasing more quickly.
Yeah, this is really helpful to disaggregate some of the national and regional trends. And what's coming through in your presentation here is just the nuance in the report. And you're quite careful to note what is left out by virtue of the availability of the data and what inferences you can make. As you've said, it covers only 4 violent crimes. Some of the definitions and reporting methods used across jurisdictions aren't the same, for example. So could you elaborate for us on some of these things so that we have a clear understanding of what the report does and doesn't say about urban violent crime?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really important thing to point out, to not overstate its conclusions and to emphasize that it's just on certain crimes. So it's homicide, I should say. And well, I guess first and foremost, as I said at the beginning, it's not people who have been convicted of crimes, right? It's police reported criminal incidents. We can get into a little more definition if it's an incident, but basically, police show up and there's a criminal incident, they put it in a police report. So we've got homicide, aggravated assault, sexual assault, which itself contains 3 categories, and robbery. So those are 4 very big and very important violent crimes. And I think that, for example, somewhere like Winnipeg, and I don't think anyone's done this, but it would be wrong for someone to say, oh, violent crime isn't up in Winnipeg because they're only looking at those 4 violent crimes. And that the areas where violent crime is high on these 4 crimes are the areas where Statistics Canada's more detailed assessment also shows growth in crimes. So we're not measuring the severity of crimes. Each homicide is an N of 1, each robbery is an N of 1. But Statistics Canada has a violent crime severity index that includes much more and includes things like attempted murder that aren't listed in this. So it's not necessarily, and I should say as well, things like property crime, which not necessarily categorized as violent crime. In fact, they aren't. But a lot of people, see that as a sort of very invasive, problematic thing that's increasing. We're not measuring that. So it might not be a perfect metric for the perfect violent crime increase. But I think it has 2 benefits in particular, in that it can give us a good sense of the sort of granularity of digging down and seeing where is it that violent crime is increasing and how is it increasing. Because I read the Statistics Canada's reports when they come out and they say the violent crime severity index is up or down by this amount. But it is really interesting to see, in this city, robberies are actually down and aggravated assaults are way up or something like that, or to tell us trends of sexual assault increasing. And the other benefit is it can give us a good idea of sort of where things are good and where things are bad, and therefore allow police services and policymakers the opportunity to say, well, who's doing well and who's not doing well, and where can we draw from? And I don't want to, I think the Statistics Canada data could be better, but it's certainly the most comprehensive, and we use it in other reports. And I have recommendations for how to change some of that, but it's very, very useful. But this can give us a bit more timely and a bit more specific opportunity to sort of cross-reference and that sort of thing.
Right. Okay. So another thing you've worked on with MLI is the Justice Report Card. Could you describe for us what that is, what it covers, and how this report connects to it?
Sure. So the Justice Report Card is certainly more, there's a lot of data in both, but it's more comprehensive in terms of the area of the country it covers and the aspects of the criminal justice system it looks at. And I should say first and foremost that I'm the newcomer to the Justice Report Card. There were 2 reports done by Benjamin Perrin and my co-author, Richard Otis, using 2017 and 2016 data. And those were the first 2. And then for various reasons, it sort of fell off the agenda, and we decided to reinvigorate it last year. And so Rick has kindly stayed on, and he's the data guy. He came up with the original metrics and calculations, which we've continued, and they're really great. But ours is updated for most 2023 data. It came out in early January. And what it does is it takes 31 different metrics and divides those into 5 categories. And metrics are just, violent crime rate is one, for example, right? Number of cases stayed is another. And so we divide those 31 metrics, the vast majority of which come from Statistics Canada, a few come from the Department of Justice, into 5 categories: public safety, support for victims, costs and resources, fairness and access to justice, and then efficiency. And they're all related to the criminal justice system. And we have these metrics available for each province and territory, as well as the national trends. And so what we do is we plug those numbers in. We look at first individually trends over time within each province. So we can say this province is doing better, this province is doing worse. But using a particular statistical formula, we give each province a grade. And the grades are comparative relative to the other provinces. So not everyone can get an A, right? There's sort of a complicated grading system wherein some provinces are going to do better and some provinces are going to do worse. And so we're comparing them to each other. And so technically, if everyone got better, right, then and they got the same amount better, grades would stay the same. So we're not saying Canada's better than the United States or worse than Switzerland or something like that. But it gives a good sense of who's doing well and who's not doing well. So we kind of both track changes over time within provinces and also give each province a grade. And our goal, I think, is to update this every couple of years to look at trends. And in that report card, far more than in this urban crime report, I'd say that report card is more pessimistic because it's not just looking at violent crime and it's not just looking at cities. It's looking at 31 different indicators. And in particular, across the country, certain things are not moving in the right direction. I would say especially efficiency. And also in terms of fairness and access. So things like the average length of time for a criminal court case, things like the percentage of cases where the charges are either stayed or withdrawn, those are basically increasing quickly across almost every single jurisdiction. And violent crime, for example, is just one indicator, I think, of 11 in our public safety metric. And so if you look at the public safety metric on a number of different areas, places are doing okay. But within that, when you drill down at the indicators, violent crime basically up for every province. I should say, yeah, using data up to 2022, I should say, for a lot of Statistics Canada violent crime indicators. And so some broad conclusions, not surprisingly, the Atlantic provinces are sort of always the best. Nova Scotia is a little down, but PEI is just criminal justice system. It's a very small province, but that doesn't mean it has to be doing well, but it does. It's very efficient. It does well on fairness and access. It does well on just much higher grade than other places. And the Western provinces, and particularly Manitoba, Saskatchewan, BC, tend to perform not as well. Ontario had a drop since our last report card, I think 7th place. But yeah, and the last thing I'll say is that in both these reports, some of our conclusions are that we need better data. We need the data to be more accessible. It's one thing if Rick, who's got a history of studying Statistics Canada data his whole life, can go and find these and develop these, and we can produce this report. But for the public, for journalists, for policymakers, it's really difficult to access this data. I shouldn't say perhaps it's not as difficult to access, although we did have to pay for certain metrics. From Statistics Canada. But it's really difficult to look at these tables and be able to make sense of it very quickly. And we think that in both of these, there's sort of maybe not so simple, but some steps that can be done to increase the accessibility and the transparency of some of these data from all the different actors involved.
Yeah, very good. Points to the complexity of the phenomena and need for further disaggregation, access, and with this urban crime report, which we hope to do on a more regular basis, give a more accurate and frequently updated sense of the trends. So looking forward to the next.
I would say as well that it's, and of course, I'm a senior fellow and you're with MLI, so we're both probably going to be positive about Macdonald-Laurier. But as someone who just studies criminal justice, I'm really glad that this is happening. Of course, I'm glad to be part of the project. But without these reports and without the initiative from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute to put these reports together, there's just a lot that we don't know. It's in the Statistics Canada data, but it's not sort of being made public and comparative in this way. And I think it's great that MLI is doing the work, but ideally it's our governments who have the data and who are producing the data who ought to be collaborating more and making the data more transparent and accessible. I don't want to be put out of a job for the next report, but ideally this would already be out there and we wouldn't have to find and crunch these numbers ourselves.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, moving away a bit now from the specifics of the report, I want to ask you about broader crime issues that you work on in connection to your areas of expertise, which include courts and court decisions. So first one we hear a lot about is bail and repeat violent offenders. What impact has bail reform, sentencing laws, or other criminal justice reforms had on urban violent crime in particular, or crime rates more broadly?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and I'm going to begin as you probably might not be surprised with a couple of caveats. And the first thing is that in my own area of expertise and research in general is the courts, as you've mentioned, and of course courts are heavily involved in criminal justice. But I'm not someone who has, for example, been studying things like bail or even things like violent crime, for a very long period of time. I think I've got a very good handle on these statistics and on the sense of how the criminal justice system works. But but by no means am I a bail expert, as some people in my department and the sociology and criminology department on the floor above me might be. And the second thing is that I'm hesitant, and we say this in the report, to suggest any cause or effect. We say, here's the data, here are the trends. Obviously, violent crime is bad, and if it's going in the high, if it's getting higher, that's a bad thing. But beyond that, we don't make too many judgments about policies and who's doing wrong. And we say, for example, we are not saying the police services in Winnipeg are bad at their job necessarily. There might be very good reasons why Winnipeg crime is going up, and his historic, especially for not even going up, but sort of what's been historically a high rate. We don't sort of blame individual policymakers for that. With all that said, on bail, I can say a few things that are at the very least suggestive, and this flows more from our Justice Prime report. So Parliament brought in Bill C-75. I can't remember the exact year. I want to say around 2017, 2018. And the goal in the government's words, the Trudeau government's words, were to modernize bail reform by introducing this thing, and it's right in the law, called the principle of restraint. And I'm going to read a quote here, which directed judges to, quote, give primary consideration to the release of the accused at the earliest reasonable opportunity and on the least onerous conditions that are appropriate in the circumstances. So there are, debates about what to be done with criminal justice policy, but I think what's beyond debate is that is put in to our criminal code and enables judges and instructs judges to release more people on bail, right? They call it modernize. One can say reform is a more neutral term, but at the very least, that is the implication of that. What we have subsequently is a spate of high-profile murders involving violent offenders out on bail. Again, is that because of Bill C-75? I can't say. I don't have the data to say that is why. And as I mentioned, a lot of this there's a lot of anecdotes, and they're high profile, but it is anecdotal. And I don't have data on how many violent offenders out on bail are committing violent crimes relative to before that bill. In response to that, Canada's premiers, including ones who are progressive on crime issues, unanimously asked the federal government to strengthen bail requirements. And the Liberals then introduced and passed Bill C-48, which I think was passed about a year ago, which doesn't completely reverse Bill C-75, but restricts bail in certain circumstances for certain violent offenders. And I'm careful to not say, I'm about 98% sure, but I could be wrong, that principle of restraint still exists in the criminal code, that the Bill C-48 did not get rid of that. So it didn't fully go back. And so I would say that insofar as that's the direction things have gone, and one who's in favor of the bail reform that the Liberals brought in could say that they were put under pressure by the premiers and the public, and it was a bad policy, and C-48 shouldn't have happened. But I would say at the very least that the burden of proof ought to lie with those who oppose bail restrictions and who favored that principle of restraint, to show that actually these things are unconnected, that actually the data show that the high-profile murders had nothing to do, because just logically, you think if you allow more people out on bail and there are people who are committing violent crimes who have been out on bail, irrespective, and I'm happy to get into the conversation about what we should do, right? What I think is a good public policy for violent offenders. But it stands to reason that perhaps that policy might have had an effect on those, because that's sort of the purpose of the policy in certain ways. To give the government credit, I wouldn't say their purpose of the policy is to allow violent offenders out, but it's a logical implication of the policy. So to get back to a point earlier in terms of data collection, it's been a big debate in Ontario recently. I'm not sure if you followed about publishing which judges statistically are more likely to grant bail, something the Ford government's interested in. I'm all for more data, more transparency when it comes to courts and judges and all aspects of the criminal justice system. And perhaps it's not that hard to do with some digging. But I think an important next step is to find in some way, if it's possible, to what extent have there actually been more violent offenders released on bail? What types of offenders are they? And that, I would surmise, is much more difficult data to obtain than going to Statistics Canada websites or going to the MCCA websites, taking the numbers that are already there and putting them into Excel spreadsheet and crunching them. Yeah. So that's my view on bail. I can say a bit more about sentencing laws if you're interested, or if you had another question.
Yeah, well, I have a comment for you, Dave, in regard to bail. Because you mentioned C-48, which placed some restrictions on the earlier bill, Bill C-75, which was actually, I think, in large part in response to some Supreme Court decisions, Antic and Zora, that emphasized, okay, you need to respect the primacy of bail. And C-48, at the behest of the provinces, created a reverse onus. So it just places the onus on the defendant to prove that they deserve bail, and it was restricted to certain dangerous offenses, those involving firearm and these sorts of things. And I think we may see the data come out in years to come, but without changes to sentencing, if indeed as you're suggesting, maybe the case, people out on bail are committing more violent crimes, without changes to sentencing, which is the final judgment, you're going to get in provincial prisons, for the most part, which house offenders 2 years less a day, or those remanded to custody while awaiting trial, you're going to see more people denied bail, but they'll just go in kind of a revolving door, short stays. It could actually increase the risk and kind of a negative environment within corrections, and ultimately not necessarily have a significant deterrent effect or lead to people just back out after they if they're not ultimately sentenced. So I think it's definitely worth looking at the issue comprehensively, as you say, and with the data where it's possible, and probably looking at sentencing as well, especially for the most serious crimes, because it's just one piece of the puzzle, this bail question.
Yeah, and I think I'm really glad that you reminded me what I'd forgotten about the reverse onus provision being the crux of Bill C-48, not a reversal of 75, as it's often, I think, portrayed in the media. It's portrayed as and it is a walking back in terms of the principle of what judges should do with bail. But without having read Antic in quite some time, and to be frank, when I read it, I don't think I read the whole thing. That's the Supreme Court decision. What I do know is that Supreme Court and courts in general really don't like reverse onus provisions. They tend to find them contrary to and unreasonable limits on charter rights. And so it wouldn't shock me if these end up getting struck down or modified in some way. And I'm not always sure that the reverse onus provision is the best way to deal with broader issues of violent crime. But if I could say a few things about sentencing that I think is really interesting in this debate is that one thing I'm seeing a lot of, and I saw it from, let's say, the left in the Harper years, and I'm seeing it more from the conservative side in these years as violent crime going up, is this connection between the idea that because crime rates are increasing or decreasing, sentencing needs to change. So it was a really familiar refrain from people who are critical of Stephen Harper's criminal justice policies, which is to say, most criminologists and sociologists and political scientists studying criminal justice in the country to say, why is he increasing sentences? Violent crime is going down. There were also other reasons, they didn't like the idea that we were going to have to build more prisons, and tough on crime doesn't work as a deterrent, these arguments. But now we hear, we need tougher sentences because violent crime is going up. And for me, I think when we look at the purposes of sentencing, and there are several in the criminal code and in Supreme Court jurisprudence, yes, in terms of violent crime, the principle of deterrence is an important one. But I think that when it comes to sentences, a more important principle, more important than the rehabilitation and deterrence in and of themselves for serious violent crimes, is just proportionality in sentencing, right? That this is a great speech by former Supreme Court Justice Morris Fish, which was published in an article on proportionality as a principle of sentencing. But the idea that, if we as a society decide that a murder is worth 25 years in prison, then that murderer ought not to be more or less culpable because of the rate at which other people are committing violent crimes at the same time as them, right? That an offender in 2023 is more worthy of punishment than the offender in 2022 because of a change in violent crime rates, or more likely 2012, or that the offender in Winnipeg ought to be more deserving of punishment than the offender in the York region because crimes are there. Like, to me, I think that's a really flimsy basis on which to base punishment. And lest I sound like someone who is, recommending more lenient sentences, that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting that, and in fact, quite frankly, I think for their most serious violent crimes, I have no issue with mandatory minimum sentences. I think our sentencing can be quite light. And I think that in particular, we look at another principle of criminal justice sentencing, and this is one that we're seeing implicitly in things that, for example, Pierre Poilievre is saying, but not necessarily explicitly, is this term incapacitation, right? For certain offenders who are high risk, violent crime, repeat offenders, I think it makes perfect sense to say the first thing to do is get this person off the streets, right? And that's the term you're more likely to hear, as opposed to incapacitation, and to do it permanently. And I think that's often lost in discussions of sentencing and violent crime, is that is incapacitation the most important principle for someone who is going into unlocked cars with no one in them and taking things from the glove compartment? Maybe not. But for someone who is seriously committing violent crimes as on a repeat basis, then incapacitation is a really important principle. And so I think it's not something that you brought up, but when I think of sentencing, that's something that always irks me, is saying violent crime rates are up or down, therefore sentencing needs to increase. For me, that we decide as a society what the sentencing ought to be, and the level of crime ought not to really have a huge influence on those sentences.
Yeah, that's interesting what you say there, Dave, and I certainly agree, of course, and I don't think you would disagree with this. Our policy choices need to reflect what we think is going to make an improvement to a certain degree. But the law and the basis upon which judges are interpreting it, there has been a shift towards this sociological analysis, right? Of, okay, we're going to look at, based on some hypothetical social science, how this might affect things, and base rulings on that. And I think you're quite right to suggest there that no, I mean, if there is a reason stated through the policy determination, and that becomes law, then that's the basis upon which the judgment should be made, right? And not all of this kind of hypothetical analysis about, well, what may happen as a result of that. So yeah, very, very interesting. Before we conclude, Dave, just want to ask you for your thoughts on the role the federal government and provincial governments play in addressing urban violent crime, and for that matter, local police services to that extent. And then just get your thoughts on whether you think current crime prevention strategies and policies are working effectively in Canada, where there's room for improvement.
Yeah, those are great questions. In the first, I think that it's not perfect. This distinction I'm about to make, but I think it does explain most of criminal justice policy, that we have overlapping authority with provincial and federal governments, but I think of it in terms of policy direction versus policy administration. And I know we don't like to think of police officers as doing, administration, and I'm not suggesting that the work they do is merely administrative, but for the most part, the federal government defines and makes the criminal law, and that's mostly what they do. And then they appoint the judges to the higher provincial courts, but they define, this is what's acceptable, this is what's not, these are what the principles of sentencing are, these sorts of things. This is now a crime, this is not a crime. So that's the policy direction that we get from the federal government. And then the provinces, which include the provincial and municipal police services, they administer the system, they administer the courts, they determine what we're going to focus on in terms of crime prevention. They execute the laws. And so maybe administration sounds too blasé. It's a lot more, we could talk about execution and enforcement administration, but they're not necessarily providing the high level policy direction. So both levels of government play important roles. Both levels of government can get it right, get it wrong. And I certainly have no special insight into crime prevention strategies at the municipal police service level. One thing I will mention, and we mentioned in the report, is that the example of sexual assault, yes, rates are increasing everywhere. What part of that is people are sexually assaulting other people more? And what part of that is, particularly since the Me Too movement, there's been an increased emphasis by policymakers on focusing on sexual assault, by police services on dealing with sexual assault. and on individuals to report sexual assault. That's all part of the mix that probably increases collectively the increase in sexual assault rates. And I'm very hesitant to say an increase in violent crime rates is good. But if any part of the increase in sexual assault rates is because people, and in particular women, are more willing to report than they were before because of changing societal norms and more trust in the administration of justice, then that part of that is a good thing. So that's somewhere where provincial governments and individual police services can play a really important role in focusing on specific crimes. Our report doesn't tell us necessarily what they're doing well and what they're doing poorly, but it gives us a baseline of statistics that we can work from to develop an understanding. On the second question, our current crime prevention strategies, I think you said, working effectively in Canada. I will give a whole, and this is not to cast aspersions on any government or police services, but just to say, no, they aren't, right? Not to say people aren't doing a good job, not to say they're trying their hardest, but I think we ought to have a very high bar, in particular for violent crime in Canada. And so what constitutes working effectively would be a substantial decrease across the board in violent crime rates. And maybe that's an impossible bar to aim for. And maybe that's something that I understand why different municipalities and police services would suggest more incremental ideas to try and make changes, things beyond people's control. You think about something like the opiate crisis and the way it's contributing to all of this. Maybe it's impossible, but I don't think that we should therefore say, so it's working as effectively as possible. More than most policy areas outside perhaps of healthcare. Crime involves issues of life and death, of things that are, of security and of being able to live safe and secure in our communities and raise our families. And I happen to, for example, live in a relatively low crime city in Guelph and live in a very, very low crime neighborhood in the suburbs towards the outskirts of Guelph. And I'm very lucky and privileged to be able to do that. But I know that the sort of difference that is between when I lived even in downtown Guelph or downtown Calgary in the past, downtown Halifax, of just being, surrounded by more criminal activity going on in one's quality of life. And to the extent that we can improve that, I think that's extremely important. If people take away from this report, oh, look, see, crime rates are flat in lots of places. They're even decreasing for certain crimes. So everything's fine or everything's good with respect to that. I think that's the wrong thing to take away. And while I think it's important to talk about the nuance in all these crime rates, and I don't want to overstate the increase. The tenor of our report is not violent crime up across 9 cities for all 4 crimes. That's not true. But I think violent crime levels, even if they're lower than what they are in the States, they're far too high to begin with. And if they aren't dropping precipitously, then our current strategies are not working well enough.
Great. Perfect point to end on, Dave. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Dave Snow, Professor of Political Science at the University of Guelph and MLI Senior Fellow. I'm Peter Copeland for Inside Policy at MLI. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Peter.